Sometimes the deepest bonds are formed between the most unlikely souls. In a world that seems to have forgotten compassion, the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. In 1879 Arizona, an old Apache chief named Nantan sits alone with his wounded eagle, Shadowwing. Both are broken remnants of a vanishing world. Then a barefoot little girl appears from the darkness, carrying only silence and a small bundle. She offers him water and gently touches the injured bird. When Nantan sees the birthmark on her hand, he recognizes an ancient tribal symbol thought lost forever. This mysterious child begins helping him heal the eagle, her quiet presence stirring something long dead in his heart. But bounty hunters are searching for a runaway girl, and whispers spread through the nearby settlement. What secret does this child carry that makes her so dangerous? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under a copper sky, its red dust settling into every crease of weathered skin and worn fabric. Here, in this harsh landscape where only the resilient survived, Nantan had made his home among the towering saguaro cacti and jagged rock formations that rose like ancient sentinels from the desert floor. At 63, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had witnessed too much: the scattering of his people, the death of the old ways, the endless march of progress that trampled everything sacred beneath its boots. His long gray hair, streaked with silver, hung in traditional braids adorned with small eagle feathers, each one a memory of better days. His hands, though gnarled with age, remained steady and sure as they worked. The camp he had built occupied a natural shelter formed by 3 massive red rocks, their surfaces carved smooth by countless seasons of wind and rain. A small fire pit set in the center, surrounded by carefully arranged stones. His few possessions, a worn leather pouch, a water gourd, several hand-carved tools, spoke of a life pared down to essentials. This wasn't poverty. It was choice. After losing everything that mattered, Nantan had learned that true wealth lay not in accumulation, but in the ability to find peace with what remained. Shadowwing perched on a specially constructed roost made from sturdy mesquite branches. The golden eagle's right wing hung at an unnatural angle, held in place by a carefully crafted splint of desert wood and leather strips. Nantan had found the magnificent bird 3 weeks ago, shot down by some fool settler who probably thought himself a great hunter. The bullet had shattered the wing bone, and for days, Nantan wasn't sure the proud creature would survive. Every morning and evening, he changed the dressing, speaking to Shadowwing in the ancient Apache tongue that grew more precious with each passing day. The eagle's fierce yellow eyes held an intelligence that bordered on human understanding, and sometimes Nantan felt they were the only 2 beings left who remembered what this land had been before the railroads and mining claims and cattle ranches carved it into pieces. "You and I, old friend," he murmured as he adjusted the splint with gentle fingers. "We are the last of something that once soared free." Shadowwing's head turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, light, hesitant, but becoming familiar. The child emerged from behind the largest boulder, moving with the careful silence that spoke of someone who had learned to avoid drawing attention. She couldn't be more than 7 years old, with tangled brown hair that caught the late afternoon sun and revealed hints of red. Her dress, once probably blue, had faded to the color of desert sage and bore the dust and tears of hard travel. But it was her eyes that stopped a heart-deep brown, ancient beyond her years, carrying shadows that no child should know. They held a wariness that reminded Nantan of wounded animals, alert to every sound and movement, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. She approached the fire with the same cautious reverence she had shown for the past 4 days. Since that first evening when she had materialized from the gathering darkness like a spirit of the desert itself. In her small hands, she carried a battered tin cup filled with water from the spring that bubbled up from the rocks. Half a mile away. Without speaking, she had not uttered a single word since her arrival. She offered the cup to Nantan with both hands, the gesture formal and respectful in a way that spoke of careful upbringing somewhere in her past. He accepted it with equal solemnity, understanding that this daily ritual had become important to them both. After he drank, she moved toward Shadow Wing with movements so slow and gentle they seemed choreographed. The eagle who would strike at any other stranger watched her approach with what could only be described as patience. She extended her small hand toward his beak, allowing him to examine her scent, then traced one finger along his breast feathers with a touch so light it barely disturbed them. It was then, as she reached to adjust the water dish near Shadow Wing's perch, that Nantan saw it clearly for the first time. The birthmark on her right palm caught the firelight, a perfect circle with 3 straight lines radiating outward, like a small sun casting rays in 3 directions. His breath caught in his throat as memories rushed back like floodwater through a broken dam. The mark of the Hawk clan, the symbol his grandmother had described in the old stories, the sign that had been carved into sacred stones and painted on ceremonial shields. A mark that was supposed to have vanished when the last of the Hawk people died in the massacre at Bitter Creek 30 years ago. The child noticed his stare and quickly closed her fist, pulling her hand against her chest in a protective gesture that spoke of shame or fear. She had learned to hide the mark, that much was clear. But from whom? And why? As if sensing the weight of the moment, Shadow Wing spread his good wings slightly and made a soft sound, not quite a cry, more like a whisper of wind through feathers. The girl looked up at the eagle, and for just an instant, her guarded expression softened into something approaching wonder. Nantan rose slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting cross-legged by the fire. He walked to a wooden chest that held his most precious possessions and withdrew a small buckskin pouch. From within, he carefully extracted a piece of turquoise carved with symbols that had been ancient when his grandfather was young. The girl watched as he held the stone toward the firelight, revealing the same pattern etched into its surface, the circle with 3 radiating lines. Her eyes widened, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked directly into his face with something other than fear. "Child," he said softly in Apache, then repeated in English, "Where did you come from?" She shook her head, the wariness returning to her features like shutters closing over windows. But something had changed in the space between them. A door had been opened, even if neither of them was ready to walk through it yet. The settlement of Copper Springs lay 8 miles to the east, a collection of adobe buildings and false-fronted stores that served the miners and ranchers scattered throughout the territory. It was a hard place filled with hard people, most of whom viewed the few remaining Apache with suspicion at best, hostility at worst. Nantan ventured there only when necessary, trading the intricate beadwork and carved items he created for supplies he couldn't find or make in the desert. The townspeople tolerated him because he caused no trouble, and because some of the older residents remembered when his interventions had prevented conflicts that could have turned the territory into a bloodbath. But tolerance was a fragile thing, and he knew that the arrival of a mysterious child in his camp would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Martha Clearwater, who ran the general store with her husband, was one of the few who treated him with genuine respect. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with graying hair pulled back severely and hands that bore the calluses of honest work. More importantly, she was one of the few people in Copper Springs who seemed to understand that the Indians weren't all the same, that there were differences between the raiders who had terrorized isolated homesteads and men like Nantan who had chosen a path of peace. 3 days ago, when he had gone to town for salt and coffee, Martha had pulled him aside with an expression of concern creasing her weathered features. "There's been talk, Nantan," she had said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. Men asking questions about missing children. Bounty hunters from the look of them. You haven't seen anything unusual out your way, have you? He had shaken his head, which wasn't exactly a lie. At that point, the child had only been with him for one day, and he wasn't sure she was anything more than a lost traveler who would move on when she felt ready. But now, seeing the birthmark and the way, she moved among his possessions with the careful respect of someone raised in the old traditions. He began to suspect that her arrival was anything but coincidental. The territory was vast, and there were 100 places a fleeing child might have sought shelter. Yet she had come to him, to the one man who might recognize the significance of the mark she bore dot as the fire burned low and the desert night settled around them with its familiar sounds, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures. In the brush, the whisper of wind through stone, Nantan found himself studying the child with new eyes. She sat curled against one of the rocks, her small bundle clutched in her arms, staring into the flames with the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. Something had driven her here, something that had stripped away the usual chattiness of childhood and replaced it with the careful silence of someone who had learned that words could be dangerous. In her face, he saw echoes of every displaced person he had ever known, every soul torn from the place they belonged and cast adrift in a world that viewed them as problems to be solved rather than human beings deserving of compassion. Shadow. Wing shifted on his perch, settling his feathers with a soft rustling sound that seemed almost like a sigh. The eagle's recovery was progressing better than Nantan had dared hope, but he knew the true test would come when the splint was removed. And Shadow Wing tried to fly again. Some injuries healed completely. Others left invisible scars that never quite allowed a return to the freedom that had been lost. Looking at the child, Nantan wondered which kind of healing awaited her, and whether he possessed the wisdom to guide her toward it. The stars emerged one by one in the clear desert sky, brilliant points of light, unmarred by the smoke and glare of distant cities. This was the same sky his ancestors had read for guidance, the same constellations that had watched over countless generations of his people. Somewhere among those stars, the spirits of the Hawk clan rested, and Nantan found himself wondering if they had somehow guided this child to his fire dot as the night deepened and the child finally surrendered to sleep. Still clutching her mysterious bundle, Nantan remained awake, tending the fire and pondering the questions that multiplied like sparks rising into the darkness. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do about the bounty hunters who were surely closing in with each passing day? Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in the peaceful circle of firelight, an old Apache and a wounded eagle kept watch over a sleeping child who might hold the key to mysteries that reached back through generations of pain and loss to something that had once been whole. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern peaks when Nantan heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders, moving with the purposeful pace of men on business, their saddle leather creaking in rhythm with hoofbeats that echoed off the canyon walls. He quickly moved to wake the child, but she was already stirring, her survival instinct sharp enough to detect danger even in sleep. Without a word, she gathered her bundle and slipped behind the largest boulder, becoming invisible in the way that only someone practiced in hiding could manage. Shadow Wing sensed the tension and remained perfectly still on his perch, his keen eyes tracking the sound of the approaching strangers. The lead rider was a tall man with a cruel mouth and eyes like chips of flint. His companions flanked him with the easy cooperation of men who had worked together before, their hands resting casually near their weapons. They wore the dust-stained clothes of travelers, but their boots were expensive leather, and their horses showed the kind of care that spoke of serious money behind their mission. "You there," the leader called out as they reined in at the edge of Nantan's camp. "You seen a little girl come through here?" about 7 years old, brown hair, traveling alone. Nantan rose slowly from where he'd been tending the fire, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He had dealt with men like these before, the kind who saw the world in terms of what they could take from it. Many travelers pass through the desert, he replied carefully. The land is vast, and I do not see everyone who crosses it. The second rider, a stocky man with tobacco-stained teeth, spat into the dust. Don't give us that noble savage routine. Old man, we're looking for a runaway ward of the state. Rebecca Hayes. There's good money for information leading to her recovery. From his vest pocket, the leader produced a folded piece of paper and shook it open. A wanted poster, professionally printed with the kind of resources that suggested official backing. The sketch showed a young girl with large eyes and solemn expression, and beneath it, bold letters proclaimed, "Reward, $500 for the safe return of Rebecca Hayes, age 7, Orphan ward of the Territorial Authority, $500. More money than most families in the territory saw in 2 years. The kind of sum that would make even honest men consider compromising their principles. She's dangerous, the leader continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man accustomed to being believed without question. Mentally disturbed from what happened to her family. She's already hurt one person trying to help her. We're just trying to get her back where she belongs, where she can receive proper medical treatment." Behind the rock, Nantan could sense the child's fear like a living thing. He thought of the gentle way she tended shadowing, the respectful manner in which she offered water each evening, the careful way she moved through his camp without disturbing anything. If this was a dangerous, mentally disturbed child, then he had lost all ability to judge character. "I have seen no such child," he said finally. "But if I do, I will remember your words." The leader's eyes narrowed, studying Nantan with the calculated assessment of a predator, deciding whether prey was worth the effort of pursuit. "You sure about that, Chief? Because helping a fugitive makes you an accessory. That's a hanging offense." "In some parts. I am sure of what I have seen and what I have not seen," Nantan replied with the dignified calm that had served him through decades of dealing with hostile officials. "My eyes may be old, but they still work fine." The third man, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward in his saddle. "What about the bird? That's a trained eagle, isn't it? Indians use them for hunting, tracking. Maybe it's seen something. You haven't." Shadowwing chose that moment to spread his good wing and let out a piercing cry that echoed off the canyon walls like a challenge. The horses shied nervously, and the stocky rider's hand moved instinctively toward his gun before he caught himself. "The eagle is wounded," Nantan said, allowing a slight smile to touch his lips. "He sees only what is here in this camp, and he has little interest in human affairs." The leader studied the camp more carefully, his gaze taking in every detail. The simple arrangement of rocks and fire pit, the few personal belongings, the absence of any sign that a child had been present. Nantan had chosen this location partly for its natural concealment, and partly because the rocky ground showed few footprints, even his own. "Well, if you do see anything," the leader said finally, folding the poster and tucking it back into his vest, "there's a telegraph office in Copper Springs. Send word to Marshal Williams in Tucson. Like I said, there's good money in it for helpful citizens." They wheeled their horses and rode away with the same purposeful pace that had brought them, leaving only dust and the lingering scent of leather and horse sweat. Nantan waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before speaking. "They are gone, child. You can come out now." She emerged from her hiding place like a shadow given substance, her face pale but composed. For the first time since her arrival, she looked directly into his eyes and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to hear. "My name isn't Rebecca." The words hung in the desert air like smoke from green wood, significant and lingering. Nantan nodded slowly, understanding that this simple declaration represented a choice on her part, the decision to trust him with something more valuable than gold. She hesitated, glancing toward Shadowwing as if drawing strength from the eagle's calm presence. I don't remember my real name. They called me Rebecca at the school, but that wasn't who I am. The school. Not an orphanage then, but one of the government institutions where Indian children were sent to have their heritage stripped away. Nantan had heard the stories, seen the broken spirits of children who returned speaking only English, wearing white man's clothes, forbidden to acknowledge their own families or traditions. "Tell me about the school," he said gently, settling back down beside the fire and indicating that she should join him. She approached slowly, still clutching her bundle, and sat on the opposite side of the fire pit. Several long minutes, she stared into the flames as if searching for the right words, or perhaps the courage to speak them. "They said my parents died in a wagon accident," she began finally. "Said I was lucky to be rescued and brought somewhere safe, but I remember different things. Not a wagon. Not an accident." Shadowwing shifted on his perch, making a soft sound that seemed almost like encouragement. The child looked up at the eagle and continued, her voice growing stronger. "I remember fire, but not from a stove or fireplace. And screaming. And my mother telling me to run, to hide in the rocks and not come out no matter what I heard." She touched the birthmark on her palm unconsciously. She told me this made me special, made me part of something important. But at the school, they said it was just a deformity, something to be ashamed of. The pieces were beginning to fit together in Nantan's mind, forming a picture that made his chest tight with familiar grief. The Hawk clan had been destroyed, not in a single battle, but through a series of attacks over several years. Families scattered, children taken, the survivors scattered to the four winds. If this child was truly one of the Hawk people, she might be the last living link to a lineage that stretched back centuries. "The school," he prompted gently. "What was it like?" Her hands tightened on the bundle, and he saw her jaw set with a determination that reminded him of warriors he had known. "They cut my hair, made me wear their dresses and speak only English. If we were caught using any native words or customs, we were beaten. They said they were saving our souls by killing the Indian in us." The familiar anger rose in Nantan's chest, but he kept his voice level. "How did you escape?" "There was a man," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper again. "He worked at the school, said he was there to help us. But at night, he would come to some of the girls' rooms. When I tried to fight him off, he said no one would believe me because I was just a savage child making up stories." Nantan's hands clenched into fists. He had heard such stories before, tales of men who saw the powerless as easy prey, who used their positions of authority to inflict horrors that would never be prosecuted or punished. One night, I heard him coming down the hall toward my room. I had been working on loosening one of the window boards for weeks, and it finally came free. I climbed out and ran into the desert. I've been walking for, I don't know how long, many days. She looked up at him then, her young face showing a maturity that no child should possess. "I followed the stars, like something inside told me to do. They led me here, to you and Shadowwing." As if responding to his name, the eagle spread his wing again and made a sound that was almost musical. The child smiled, the first genuine smile Nantan had seen from her, and rose to approach the perch. "He's getting stronger," she observed, reaching out to stroke the eagle's breast feathers. "The wing is healing well. Soon he'll be ready to fly again." "Soon," Nantan agreed, watching the easy interaction between child and bird. "But not yet. He needs more time to regain his full strength." "Like me," she said softly, then looked back at Nantan with eyes that held more wisdom than her years should have allowed. "Those men who came here, they weren't really lawmen, were they?" "What makes you say that?" "Real lawmen would have asked different questions." They would have been more interested in whether I was safe than in collecting a reward. And they wouldn't have threatened you for not helping them. Smart girl. Observant. Another trait that spoke of careful upbringing in the traditional ways, where survival often depended on reading the true intentions of strangers. No, men, I do not think they were lawmen. But they will return, and they will bring others. The desert is large, but there are only so many places where someone might hide. She nodded gravely, accepting this reality with the stoicism of someone who had already faced more hardship than most adults. What should we do? Not what should I do, or where should I go? She had made her choice, and in that single word, she had claimed the place beside him in whatever was to come. Nantan looked at the wanted poster that had fallen from his pocket when he rose to greet the riders. $500 for a child who was probably worth far more than that to people with hidden agendas. The kind of money that would bring every opportunist and fortune hunter in the territory converging on this area like vultures drawn to carrion. But as he looked at the girl, this possible last daughter of the Hawk clan, this survivor of horrors, that would have broken many adults. He realized that the decision had already been made. Perhaps it had been made the moment she first appeared at his fire, offering water with the formal courtesy of the old ways. Perhaps it had been written in the stars his ancestors read, planned by spirits who saw further into the future than mortal eyes could reach. We prepare, he said simply, and we learn to trust each other completely, because our lives may depend on it. She nodded again, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity. They were no longer just an old Apache and a lost child sharing a fire in the desert. They had become something more, a family forged by necessity and choice, bound together by shared danger and mutual recognition of something precious that needed protecting. Shadowwing cried out again, his voice carrying across the desert like a declaration of defiance. The eagle, the old man, and the child three. Wounded creatures finding strength in their unlikely bond, preparing to face whatever storms were gathering on the horizon. The decision came to Nantan in the quiet hour before dawn, when the desert held its breath between night and day. Lying on his blanket near the dying fire, listening to the child's steady breathing from where she slept curled against the rocks, he understood with crystalline clarity that their lives had become intertwined in ways that went beyond chance or convenience. She was Hawk Clan. He was certain of it now, as certain as he was of the sunrise that would soon paint the eastern peaks, gold and crimson. The birthmark, her instinctive knowledge of proper customs, the way she moved through the world with the careful awareness that spoke of traditional training, all of it pointed to a heritage that connected her to his own people through bonds older than the white man's laws. And if she was truly Hawk Clan, then she was his responsibility in ways that transcended personal choice. The old ways demanded protection of the young, especially those who carried sacred bloodlines. To turn her over to men who had already proven their willingness to lie and threaten would be not just cowardice, but a betrayal of everything his ancestors had stood for. As the first light touched the tops of the saguaros, he rose and began the work of transformation. If they were to survive what was coming, both he and the child would need to become something more than they had been before. "Wake up, little hawk," he said softly, using the Apache words that felt right on his tongue. "Today your real education begins." She stirred and opened her eyes, instantly alert in the way of someone who had learned to sleep with one ear always listening for danger. "Little hawk? It is what I will call you until you remember your true name," he explained, beginning to gather certain items from his possessions. "The hawk is sacred to your clan, a messenger between the earth and sky. The name suits you." She sat up, automatically checking to make sure her bundle was still secure beside her. "What are we going to do?" "We are going to prepare for war," Nantan said simply. "Not the kind fought with guns and cavalry charges, but the kind fought with wisdom patience, and the knowledge of how to live when others would see you dead. From his leather pouch, he withdrew a piece of wood no longer than his thumb, carved from the branch of a desert willow tree that had been struck by lightning. For 3 days, he had worked on it during the quiet evening hours, shaping it with his knife and smoothing it with sandstone until it had become what he envisioned: an eagle whistle, carved in the traditional way with the 3 holes that would produce the pure, piercing call that could summon the great birds from miles away. He had made it for her, though he hadn't been conscious of the intention until this moment. "Hold out your hands," he instructed, and when she complied, he placed the whistle in her palms with the same ceremony his grandfather had used when passing on sacred objects. "This is your first gift as my daughter. Not a daughter of blood, but a daughter of choice and spirit." Her eyes widened as she examined the intricate carving, her small fingers tracing the symbols he had etched around the holes, representations of eagles in flight, of wind patterns, of the sacred directions that governed Apache understanding of the world. "Daughter," she whispered. "If you accept it," Nantan said, "the choice is yours. But if you do accept, it means you become part of something larger than either of us alone. It means you learn the old ways, the true ways, and you carry them forward, even when the world tries to convince you they have no value." She closed her fingers around the whistle and nodded solemnly. "I accept. Then blow the whistle 3 times and call Shadowwing to witness your decision." She raised the instrument to her lips and produced 3 clear, strong notes that echoed off the canyon walls like musical lightning. Shadowwing immediately responded, spreading his good wing and crying out in return, his voice harmonizing with the fading echoes of the whistle in a way that raised the hair on Nantan's arms. "Good," he said, satisfaction warming his voice. "Now, we begin the lessons that will keep you alive over the next several hours." As the sun climbed higher and the desert began its daily transformation from cool morning sanctuary to blazing afternoon furnace, Nantan taught her things that no government school would ever include in its curriculum: how to read the landscape for signs of water, danger, and concealment, how to move across rocky ground without leaving tracks that could be followed, how to identify edible plants and distinguish them from their poisonous cousins, how to build a fire that would produce heat but minimal smoke, and how to extinguish it completely so that no trace remained. Most importantly, he began teaching her the language of her people, not just words, but the concepts and ways of thinking that had allowed the Apache to survive in this harsh land for countless generations. The white man sees the desert as empty space to be crossed or conquered, he explained as they practiced identifying animal tracks in the sandy wash below their camp. "We see it as home, filled with relatives who speak to those who know how to listen." She proved to be a quick student, absorbing information with the hunger of someone who had been starved for knowledge that felt true and useful. When she successfully identified the tracks of a kit fox and correctly predicted which direction it had been traveling, her smile was brighter than the desert sun. "You have good instincts," Nantan told her as they rested in the shade of a Palo Verde tree. "But instincts must be paired with wisdom. Tell me, what did you observe about those men who came looking for you?" Her expression grew serious as she considered the question. "They weren't really interested in helping me. They were interested in the money. What else? They threatened you when you didn't immediately give them what they wanted. People who are truly trying to help don't make threats." "Good. What about their horses?" She frowned, thinking back. They were well cared for. Good saddles, good bridles, expensive. Which tells us what? They have money behind them. Real money, not just the reward they mentioned. Nantan nodded approvingly. "You see clearly, Little Hawk. Never forget that most people will reveal their true intentions through their actions, not their words. The man who speaks of helping you while carrying a gun is not your friend." As they walked back toward camp, Shadowwing watched their approach with what seemed like approval. The eagle had been taking short flights around the immediate area, testing his healing wing and gradually rebuilding the strength he would need for longer journeys. "He's getting better," the child observed, using the Apache words Nantan had taught her for describing health and healing. "Yes, but he's also restless. Soon he will be ready to fly far from this place, and we may need to follow him." "Follow him where?" "Wherever the spirits guide him. Eagles see things that we cannot, travel paths that are hidden from earthbound eyes. If we are wise, we listen when they call." That afternoon, as the heat reached its peak, and even the hardiest desert creatures sought shade, an unexpected visitor appeared at their camp. Deputy Marshal Thomas Coleman rode up the rocky trail with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who was comfortable in his own skin and confident in his authority. Coleman was perhaps 40 years old, with the weathered face and steady hands of someone who had spent most of his adult life outdoors. Unlike the bounty hunters who had visited that morning, he wore his badge openly and carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. "Afternoon, Nantan," he said, dismounting and removing his hat in a gesture of respect that immediately differentiated him from the earlier visitors. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by." "Marshal Coleman," Nantan replied carefully, "you are always welcome at my fire, but I suspect this is not a social visit." "No, I'm afraid not." Coleman's eyes swept the camp, taking in details with the practiced observation of an experienced lawman, but without the predatory calculation that had marked the bounty hunters. "I've been hearing stories about men asking questions in town. Men who claim to be working for the territorial authority, looking for a missing child." Nantan kept his expression neutral, but internally he was calculating distances, escape routes, and the likelihood that the child could successfully hide again if necessary. There are always men asking questions about something. True enough. Coleman accepted a cup of water that Nantan offered, another small courtesy that spoke of mutual respect. "But these particular men have been showing around a wanted poster for a girl named Rebecca Hayes, substantial reward being offered. And I've never heard of any Rebecca Hayes, which strikes me as odd, since missing children are usually reported through official channels. I sent a telegraph to Tucson, asking Marshal Williams about the case." Nantan's pulse quickened. If Coleman had made official inquiries, it meant the careful fiction the bounty hunters had constructed might unravel quickly. "What did Marshal Williams say?" Coleman's expression grew grim. "That's the interesting part. Williams never heard of Rebecca Hayes either. In fact, he never sent any men to look for missing children in this area. Which means the fellows asking questions are either working for someone else entirely, or they're running their own game." The implications hung in the desert air like heat shimmer, visible but difficult to grasp. If the bounty hunters weren't working for the territorial authority, then who was paying them? And why were they so determined to find one small girl? "I'm telling you this," Coleman continued, "because you've always been straight with me, and because I've got a feeling there's more to this story than anyone's admitting. If you happen to know anything about missing children or fake lawmen, now might be a good time to share it." Nantan found himself at a crossroads that would determine not just his own future, but the fate of the child who had trusted him with her safety. Coleman was known throughout the territory as an honest man, someone who believed in justice over convenience and protection over persecution. But he was also an officer of the law, bound by oaths and procedures that might not allow for the kind of flexible interpretation the situation required. The decision came down to trust. The same leap of faith the child had made when she chose to speak her first words by his fire. "Marshal," he said slowly, "if I were to tell you a story about a child who escaped from a place where she was being harmed, and if I were to tell you that the men looking for her intend to return her to that harm, what would you say?" Coleman was quiet for a long moment, his steady gaze moving from Nantan to the camp to the eagle perched nearby. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the weight of carefully considered words. I'd say that my job is to protect people, especially children, from those who would do them harm. I'd also say that the law isn't always the same thing as justice, and sometimes a man has to choose which one he's going to serve. It was the answer Nantan had hoped for, but hadn't dared expect. Coleman was offering something precious, the possibility of an ally who wore a badge, but understood that sometimes the letter of the law served injustice rather than preventing it. "Little Hawk," Nantan called softly in Apache. "Come out and meet someone who may be a friend." The child emerged from behind the rocks where she had taken refuge at the first sound of approaching hoofbeats. She moved with careful dignity, her small chin raised in a way that reminded Nantan of warriors he had known who faced uncertain odds with courage they didn't necessarily feel. Coleman's expression softened as he took in her appearance, the too thin frame that spoke of hard travel and inadequate food, the guarded eyes that had seen too much, the way she instinctively stayed close to Nantan's protective presence. "Well, hello there," he said gently, crouching down to bring himself closer to her eye level. "I'm Marshal Coleman. What's your name?" She glanced at Nantan, who nodded encouragingly. "They called me Rebecca at the school," she said quietly. "But that's not who I am." "No," Coleman agreed. "I don't imagine it is. Would you like to tell me who you really are?" "I'm still remembering," she said, with the honesty that seemed to be her nature. "But Nantan calls me Little Hawk, and I like that name." Coleman's eyes sharpened with understanding. He had spent enough years in the territory to recognize the signs of a child who had been processed through the government's Indian education system, stripped of identity and culture in the name of civilization. "The school," he said carefully. "Was that where you were before you came here?" She nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the place where her bundle rested against her side. "I ran away. There was a man there who hurt children. When I tried to tell someone, they said I was lying because Indians always lie." Coleman's jaw tightened, and Nantan saw the flash of anger that crossed the marshal's weathered features. It was the reaction of a man who had devoted his life to protecting the innocent, and had little patience for those who preyed on the defenseless. "That man," Coleman said, his voice carefully controlled. "Is he the reason those other men are looking for you?" "I think so. If I tell people what he did, it would be bad for the school, bad for him." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, creating a picture that made Nantan's blood run cold. The bounty hunters weren't working for the territorial authority, they were working for the school, or for someone connected to it who had a vested interest in keeping certain activities hidden. "Little Hawk," Nantan said gently, "show Marshal Coleman your hand." She hesitated for only a moment before extending her right palm, revealing the birthmark that had changed everything. Coleman studied it with the same intensity Nantan had felt when he first recognized its significance. "That's an Apache clan marking," Coleman said slowly. "Hawk clan, if I'm not mistaken." "You know the old symbols?" Nantan asked, surprised. "My grandmother was half Chiricahua," Coleman replied. "She made sure I learned about the different clans before the knowledge was lost. The Hawk clan was supposed to have died out decades ago." "So we believed," Nantan said. "But perhaps the spirits preserved what we thought was lost." Coleman rose and walked a few steps away, his hand resting on his gun belt as he stared out at the desert landscape. When he turned back, his expression was that of a man who had made a difficult decision. "Here's what I think happened," he said. "Someone at that school, probably more than one someone, has been abusing children and covering it up. When this little girl escaped and started talking, they realized she could destroy them. So they hired men to find her and bring her back, claiming she was a ward of the state who needed to be returned for her own good. And if she disappears after being returned," Nantan added grimly, "who would ask questions about one more Indian child who couldn't adjust to civilized life?" "Exactly." Coleman's voice carried the quiet fury of a man who had seen too much injustice disguised as law and order. which means those men aren't going to give up, and they're not going to be particular about how they get what they want. As if summoned by their conversation, Shadow Wing chose that moment to launch himself from his perch and take flight. The eagle's wings caught the thermal currents rising from the heated rocks, carrying him higher and higher in lazy spirals that demonstrated his returning strength. The child watched the eagle's flight with eyes that held both joy and sadness. "He's almost ready to leave, isn't he?" "Soon," Nantan confirmed. "But not yet. And when he does leave, we may need to follow." "Follow?" Coleman asked. "The old ways teach us that eagles are messengers," Nantan explained. "They see paths that are hidden from earthbound eyes. If Shadow Wing chooses to fly toward the mountains, it may be because he knows something we do not." Coleman nodded slowly, accepting this explanation with the matter-of-fact tolerance of a man who had learned to trust wisdom wherever he found it. "How much time do you think you have before those men come back?" "Not long," Nantan replied. We'll search the nearby areas first, but when they find nothing, they will return here with more men and less patience. Then we need to move fast." Coleman walked back to his horse and began loosening the straps on his saddlebags. "I can openly help you escape. That would make me an accessory to kidnapping, at least according to the law. But I can make sure you have supplies and information." He pulled out a canvas bag filled with dried food, ammunition, and other traveling necessities. "There's also this," he added, producing a folded paper. "It's a safe passage document, signed by me, stating that you're traveling under official protection while investigating reports of Apache artifacts in the Dragoon Mountains." "You would risk your position for us?" Nantan asked. "I took an oath to serve justice," Coleman replied simply. "Sometimes that means bending rules that were written by men who never had to choose between doing what's legal and doing what's right." As the afternoon wore on and Coleman prepared to leave, Nantan felt the weight of decisions that would shape not just their immediate survival, but the course of the child's entire life. The marshal had given them a precious gift time and legitimacy that might allow them to reach safety before their pursuers could close the net. But safety was a relative concept in a territory where a man's worth was often measured by his willingness to use violence, and where children like Little Hawk were seen as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. "Marshal," the child said as Coleman mounted his horse, "thank you for believing me. Thank you for having the courage." "To tell the truth," he replied, "not many adults would have done what you did." After Coleman rode away, leaving only dust and a promise of protection that might or might not prove sufficient, Nantan and the child began the work of preparing for a journey that would take them far from the only home either of them had known. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Shadow Wing returned to his perch, folding his wings with the satisfied air of a creature who had tested his limits and found them acceptable. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would be ready for the longer flight that lay ahead. Tomorrow, they would all be ready to discover what lay beyond the familiar boundaries of their small world, in the vast unknown that held both promise and peril in equal measure. The morning brought news that changed everything. Martha Clearwater arrived before sunrise, her horse lathered with sweat and her face tight with the kind of worry that comes from bearing dangerous information. She dismounted quickly and hurried toward Nantan's fire, where he and Little Hawk were preparing their morning meal. "Nantan," she said breathlessly, "thank God I found you before they did. There are more men in town, at least 6 of them, maybe more. They're not asking polite questions anymore." Little Hawk moved instinctively closer to Nantan's side, her small hand finding his arm as Martha continued her urgent report. "They've been going door to door, searching buildings, offering money to anyone who's seen anything. But it's not just the reward they're talking about now. They're saying the girl is dangerous, that she carries some kind of disease that could spread to other children. Disease? Nantan's voice carried the skepticism of a man who had heard too many lies wrapped in the language of public safety. They claim she was exposed to something at the school, some kind of contamination that makes her a threat to any community that harbors her. It's complete nonsense, of course, but it's got people scared. Fear makes even good people do terrible things. Martha's eyes found Little Hawk, and her expression softened with the maternal instincts that had made her one of the few townspeople willing to treat Apache children with genuine kindness. "Hello, dear," she said gently. "I'm Martha. I've brought you something that might help." From her saddlebags, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a boy's clothing worn but clean trousers, a simple shirt, a hat that would help hide the child's distinctive hair. "If you're going to travel, it might be safer if you look like a boy," Martha explained. "There are fewer questions asked about Apache men traveling with their sons than about strange men with little girls." It was practical advice born of hard experience, and Little Hawk accepted the clothing with the solemn gratitude of someone who understood the value of such gifts. "There's something else," Martha continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I was cleaning out some old storage rooms yesterday and found this." She produced a yellowed piece of paper, carefully folded and brittle with age. "It's a territorial census record from 1851. Look at this entry." Nantan unfolded the document with careful hands, his eyes scanning the faded ink until he found what Martha was indicating. There, in the precise handwriting of a government clerk, was a listing for the Hawk clan of the Chiricahua Apache 12 families, 37 individuals total, noted as residing in the Dragoon Mountains region. But it was the next entry that made his breath catch. Family group leader, Joseph Crowfeather. Wife, Morning Star. Children, twin daughters, ages 3 and 5. Twin daughters, Martha repeated. The dates would be right. If one of those children survived the attacks that scattered the clan, she would be about the right age to be this child's mother, Nantan finished, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "Little Hawk, how old was your mother when she died?" The child considered the question with the careful concentration she brought to all matters involving her. Fragmented memories. "I think ... maybe 25? She seemed young, but her eyes looked old, like she had seen too much sadness." The mathematics fit. If Little Hawk's mother had been one of the twin daughters listed in the census, if she had somehow survived the destruction of her clan and lived long enough to have a child of her own, then the birthmark that had seemed like coincidence became something much more significant. "She's not just Hawk clan," Nantan said slowly. "She may be the direct descendant of the clan leaders, the keeper of bloodlines that go back centuries." The implications were staggering. Among the Apache, certain family lines carried more than just genetic heritage. They carried spiritual responsibilities, knowledge of sacred places and ceremonies, connections to the land that transcended ordinary understanding. That would explain why they're so determined to find her, Martha said grimly. If word got out that a legitimate Apache bloodline had survived, that there was still someone with rightful claims to traditional territories, ... The railroad companies, the mining interests, all the people who have built fortunes on stolen. Apache land would face serious challenges, Nantan completed. Easier to eliminate one small girl than to fight legal battles that might cost them millions. Shadow Wing chose that moment to spread his wings and cry out, his voice carrying a note of urgency that made all three humans look up. The eagle's keen eyes were focused on something in the distance, and Nantan followed his gaze to see a dust cloud rising from the direction of Copper Springs. "Riders," he said tersely. "Many of them, moving fast." Martha was already moving toward her horse. "I'll lead them away from here. Tell them I saw tracks heading toward the old mine road. That should buy you some time." "Martha," Nantan called as she swung into the saddle. Why are you helping us?" She paused, her weathered face reflecting years of watching injustice disguised as progress. "Because I had a daughter once. She died of fever when she was about this little one's age. If someone had tried to hurt her, I would have wanted people like you to stand between her and the wolves." She rode away at a gallop, disappearing behind the rock formations that had sheltered their camp. Within minutes, they could hear the sound of many horses, the shouts of men coordinating a search, the systematic approach of hunters who were no longer concerned with subtlety. "Time to go," Nantan said. But Little Hawk was already moving, gathering her few possessions with the efficiency of someone who had learned that survival often depended on the ability to leave quickly. She changed into the boy's clothing behind. A screen of rocks, emerging transformed not just in appearance but in bearing. The loose trousers and shirt disguised her feminine features, while the hat pulled low over her eyes created shadows that made her harder to identify at a distance. "What do I call myself?" she asked as they quickly broke camp, scattering the ashes of their fire and erasing traces of their presence. "What name feels right to you?" She was quiet for a moment, testing different possibilities in her mind. "David," she said finally. "It was my father's name, I think. One of the few things I remember clearly." "David Crowfeather," Nantan said, honoring both the name she had chosen and the heritage they had discovered. "It has strength." Shadowwing launched himself from his perch without being called, his instincts telling him that the time for staying had passed. He circled once overhead, then began flying toward the mountains, his powerful wings carrying him steadily away from the approaching danger. "He knows," Little Hawk now David observed. "He knows we need to follow." They set out on foot, moving with the careful haste of experienced travelers who understood that speed meant nothing if it left a trail that could be followed. Behind them, the sounds of the search grew louder, more systematic. The men hunting them were no longer asking questions or following false leads. They were conducting a military-style sweep of the area, determined to find their quarry before the day was overdone. As they climbed higher into the foothills, following game trails that were invisible to untrained eyes, Nantan found himself thinking about the census record and what it meant for the child's future. If she truly was the last surviving member of the Hawk clan leadership, then she carried more than just her own life in her small hands. She carried the hopes and dreams of an entire people, the possibility that something thought lost forever might yet be preserved. But first, they had to survive long enough for those possibilities to matter. The desert below them stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and harsh, offering both concealment and exposure in equal measure. Somewhere in that vastness, Shadowwing rode the thermal currents toward an unknown destination, trusting in instincts older than memory. And behind them, getting closer with each passing hour, came men who had reduced a child's life to a problem that could be solved with enough money and violence. The race for survival had begun in earnest, and the outcome would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of an entire cultural heritage that had already survived too much. Lost to be allowed to die now. 3 days of hard travel through increasingly rugged terrain brought them to the ancient sacred site that Nantan's grandfather had described in stories told around winter fires. The place existed in the high country where few white men ventured, hidden among rock formations that seemed to have been arranged by divine hands, rather than geological chance. The journey had tested them both. David's feet were blistered despite the sturdy moccasins Nantan had crafted for her, and her small frame showed the strain of maintaining the pace necessary to stay ahead of their pursuers. But she had not complained once, accepting hardship with the stoic endurance that seemed to be woven into her very bones. Shadowwing had led them true, always visible on the horizon, his flight path unerring as he guided them towards something that called to instincts older than conscious thought. Now he perched on a twisted juniper tree at the edge of what appeared to be an unremarkable canyon. but Nantan felt the power of the place the moment they crested the final ridge. "This is it," he said softly, recognizing landmarks from stories that had been passed down through generations. The Whispering Stones. David stood beside him, her young face reflecting the same sense of recognition, though she couldn't have explained why the place felt so familiar. The canyon below them was perhaps 100 yards across, its walls decorated with pictographs that had been painted by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. But it was the stones themselves that drew the eye and captured the imagination. 7 massive boulders, each taller than a man, arranged in a perfect circle at the canyon's heart. Their surfaces were covered with symbols carved so deeply that time and weather had only served to accent their meaning rather than erase it. "My grandmother told me about this place," Nantan said as they picked their way down the narrow trail that led to the canyon floor. "She said it was where the clans came when they needed to remember who they were, where they needed answers that could only be found by listening to the voices of the ancestors." David's hand moved unconsciously to her palm, where the birthmark seemed to tingle with awareness. As they approached the circle of stones, she felt something stirring in the depths of her memory, not clear images, but impressions, feelings, the ghost of recognition that suggested she had been here before. "I remember this," she whispered, her voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a half-forgotten dream. "My mother brought me here when I was very small. She said it was important, that I needed to see it before." She trailed off, the memory slipping away like water through cupped hands. "Before what?" Nantan prompted gently. "Before the bad men came. Before everything changed." They entered the circle together, and immediately the quality of sound changed. Their footsteps seemed both muffled and amplified, as if the stones themselves were listening to every movement. The air felt different, too charged with the kind of energy that precedes a thunderstorm, thick with possibilities that hovered just beyond perception. David walked directly to the largest stone, the one that stood at what would have been true north if the circle had been aligned with the cardinal directions. Her small hand reached out to trace symbols that were deeply carved into the granite surface, symbols that matched the pattern of her birthmark with startling precision. "The Hawk Clan stone," Nantan breathed, understanding flooding through him. "Your mother brought you here to show you your heritage, to make sure you would know this place even if everything else was lost." The stone bore the carved record of generations, family names, important dates, symbols that recorded births, deaths, and sacred events. Near the top, weathered but still legible, was carved "Morning Star, daughter of Crowfeather, mother of the next generation." Below that, in fresher carving that could not have been more than 10 years old, were the words, "David Bright Hawk, born in the season of yellow leaves, marked by the spirits for a great purpose." David stared at the carving, her birth name written in stone by a mother who had known that the world was about to change forever. "David Bright Hawk," she repeated, the words feeling both foreign and familiar on her tongue. "Your true name," Nantan confirmed. "Your mother carved it here so that, even if she could not protect you, the stones would remember who you are." But even as the moment of recognition washed over them, Shadow Wing's piercing cry from above warned them that their time of discovery was about to be interrupted. The eagle's voice carried a note of alarm that made both human hearts race with sudden adrenaline. Voices echoed off the canyon walls, men's voices, rough and determined, getting closer with each passing second. The pursuers had found their trail despite all their careful precautions, drawn perhaps by the same instincts that had guided Shadow Wing and themselves to this sacred place. "Quick," Nantan said, his mind racing through possibilities. "There must be a reason your mother brought you here, something more than just showing you the stone." David's hands moved frantically over the carved surface, searching for something that her conscious mind couldn't identify, but her inherited memory insisted must be there. Near the base of the stone, hidden among decorative patterns that seemed purely ornamental, her fingers found what they were seeking, a a section of carving that moved when pressed, revealing a hidden cavity within the stone itself. Inside, wrapped in oil leather that had protected it from decades of weather, was a small bundle that had been waiting for exactly this moment. "What is it?" Nantan asked as David carefully withdrew the package. "I don't know," she admitted. But her hands were already unwrapping the leather with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects. Inside was a collection of items that made Nantan's breath catch in recognition: traditional Apache healing stones, each one carved with symbols of power and protection. A small bundle of sage tied with sinew that had somehow retained its potent fragrance. And most precious of all, a medicine bag made from the hide of a white buffalo, decorated with beadwork so intricate it could only have been made by a master craftswoman. "The sacred medicine bundle of the Hawk clan," Nantan whispered, understanding the magnitude of what they had discovered. "Your mother hid the most precious spiritual artifacts of your people, trusting that someday you would return to claim them." The voices were getting closer now. David clutched the medicine bundle to her chest, feeling power flow through her small frame like electricity through copper wire. "What do I do with it?" she asked. "You accept the responsibility that comes with it," Nantan replied. "You become not just David Brighthawk, but the keeper of your people's spiritual heritage, the last guardian of traditions that have survived since the beginning of time." Shadowwing's cry came again, more urgent now, and through the gap in the canyon wall they could see the first of their pursuers appearing on the rim above. 6 men, heavily armed, led by the same cold-eyed leader who had visited Nantan's camp days earlier. "There!" one of them shouted, pointing down into the canyon. "I can see them by the stones." "Remember," Nantan said quickly as they prepared to run again, "you are no longer just a child fleeing from those who would harm you. You are the last daughter of the Hawk clan, and you carry the spiritual power of all your ancestors. That medicine bundle is not just sacred objects. It is the accumulated prayers and wisdom of generations. Trust in that power, and it will guide you when I cannot." David nodded solemnly, tucking the medicine bundle securely against her body. As they began to climb the far wall of the canyon, behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, more determined. The men who hunted them had found their quarry at last, and they were not going to let geography or sacred ground stand between them and their goal. But something had changed in the last few minutes. David no longer moved like a frightened child, running from danger. She moved like someone who had found their true identity, someone who understood that they carried more than their own life in their hands. The race was far from over, but now it was being run by a young woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was fighting for. The spirits of the Hawk clan had been waiting for this moment, and they would not allow their last daughter to fall while their sacred legacy remained unprotected. As they climbed toward the canyon rim and whatever lay beyond, Shadowwing soared overhead, his powerful wings catching the desert wind as he led them toward a destiny that had been written in stone long before any of them were born. The old Apache emerged from the shadows of a wind-carved alcove like a figure from David's half-remembered dreams. Running Bear stood nearly 7 feet tall despite his advanced age, his long white hair adorned with eagle feathers that seemed to catch light that didn't exist. His face bore the deep lines of someone who had lived through the destruction of an entire way of life. Yet his dark eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who had not surrendered to despair. "I have been waiting for you, daughter of the Hawk clan," he said in Apache, his voice carrying the formal cadence of traditional speech. "The spirits told me you would come, though I confess I expected someone older." David and Nantan had been climbing steadily for 2 hours, following Shadowwing's lead through terrain that grew more treacherous with each passing mile. The sounds of pursuit had faded as their hunters struggled with horses on ground that was better suited to mountain goats, but they knew the respite was temporary. "Running Bear," Nantan said with the deep respect due to an elder, "I had heard you were dead." Many times, the old man replied with dry humor. It is a useful reputation to maintain when one wishes to be left alone to think. But the spirits do not allow rest when there is work to be done. He studied David with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. You carry the medicine bundle of your clan. Good. But do you understand what it means to be its keeper? David clutched the sacred bundle more tightly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her young shoulders like a heavy cloak. I'm still learning, she admitted. Honesty is wisdom, Running Bear approved. Too many claim understanding they do not possess. Come, both of you. There are things you must see before the hunt catches up to us. He led them through a maze of rock formations that seemed impossible to navigate, but which revealed hidden passages and sheltered valleys to those who knew the ancient paths. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Running Bear spoke of things that had been hidden for decades. When the last of the Hawk clan was scattered to the winds, he said, I made it my responsibility to preserve what could be saved. Your grandmother, Morning Star, was one of the few who escaped the final massacre. She came to me pregnant and dying, carrying secrets that could not be allowed to perish with her. My grandmother? David asked, pieces of her family history falling into place like stones building a wall. She lived long enough to give birth to your mother and to pass on the location of the sacred cave where the most precious artifacts of your people were hidden. Before she died, she made me promise that if her daughter ever had children, they would be brought here to claim their heritage. They emerged into a circular valley hidden deep in the mountains, its entrance so narrow and cunningly concealed that David wondered how anyone could find it without specific knowledge. But once inside, the space opened into a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. Down at the center of the valley stood a simple structure, not quite a building, more like a shrine carved from the living rock. Its walls were covered with pictographs that told the history of the Apache people from their earliest memories to the present day, a visual record of migrations, battles, spiritual revelations, and the slow retreat before the advancing tide of European settlement. This is the memory place, Running Bear explained, where the keepers of tradition come to remember who we are when the world tries to convince us we are something else. Inside the shrine, David gasped as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The walls were lined with alcoves, each one containing artifacts that represented different aspects of Apache culture and spirituality. War shields painted with symbols of power, ceremonial masks carved from sacred woods, collections of arrow points made from obsidian that had been shaped by master craftsmen whose skills had died with them. But it was the central alcove that drew her attention, the one that held artifacts specifically associated with the Hawk clan. Running Bear gestured toward a collection of obsidian arrowheads arranged in a pattern that mirrored the constellation of stars sacred to her people. These were made by your ancestors, he said reverently. Each point was crafted for a specific purpose: hunting, warfare, ceremony. But together, they represent something more. They are the tools that allowed your people to survive in this harsh land for countless generations. David reached out to touch one of the arrowheads and immediately felt a connection that went beyond the physical. The obsidian seemed warm under her fingers, as if it retained some essence of the hands that had shaped it. Images flashed through her mind, scenes of hunters stalking deer through mountain forests, warriors defending their families against overwhelming odds, shamans using the sacred points in ceremonies that connected the earthly and spiritual realms. I can see them, she whispered. I can see my ancestors. The blood remembers what the mind forgets, Running Bear observed. You are not just carrying objects, child. You are carrying the accumulated wisdom and experience of everyone who came before you. Nantan watched this exchange with growing understanding. The girl he had found by his fire was transforming before his eyes, not into someone different, but into who she had always been meant to be. The heritage that had been stolen from her at the government school was returning like water finding. It's level, natural, and inevitable. But understanding heritage is only the first step, Running Bear continued. Now you must decide what you will do with that knowledge. What do you mean? David asked. The men who hunt you are not merely trying to recapture a runaway child. They are trying to erase the last living connection to land claims that go back centuries. If they succeed, if you disappear, then the territories your people have held sacred since time began will be lost forever. He moved to another alcove and withdrew a rolled piece of hide covered with intricate markings. This is a map, he explained, drawn by your great-grandfather, showing the traditional boundaries of Hawk Clan territory. Water sources, sacred sites, burial grounds, all the places that your people have protected and been protected by for generations beyond counting. David studied the markings, and to her amazement, she could read them. Not with her conscious mind, but with something deeper, something that recognized the symbols as clearly as if they had been written in English. The government has been systematically denying the existence of these traditional boundaries, Running Bear continued. They claim there are no surviving records, no one left who can verify the old claims. But you, as the last legitimate heir of the Hawk Clan leadership, could change. All of that. I'm just one person, David protested. And I'm only a child. You are the keeper of your people's sacred trust, Running Bear corrected gently. Age has nothing to do with the power you carry. The spirits do not choose their vessels based on convenience or timing. From outside the shrine came the sound. They had all been dreading the distant echo of horses and men, growing steadily closer despite the difficult terrain. Their pursuers had found the hidden valley, though how they had managed it remained a mystery. We must go, Nantan said urgently. They're closer than I thought possible. But Running Bear raised a hand for patience. First, the child must choose. David Brighthawk, last daughter of the Hawk Clan, will you accept the responsibility that is yours by blood and spirit? Will you become the guardian of your people's sacred legacy, knowing that choice will make you a target for the rest of your life? David looked around the shrine, at the artifacts that represented centuries of Apache survival and resistance. She thought of her mother, who had died protecting these secrets, of her grandmother, who had sacrificed everything to ensure the knowledge would survive, of all the ancestors whose blood flowed in her veins and whose hopes rested in her small hands. I accept, she said simply, and as the words left her lips, she felt something shift inside her. Not a physical change, but a spiritual one. The frightened child who had appeared at Nantan's fire was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly who she was and what she was fighting for. Running Bear smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Then take this, he said, placing a leather cord around her neck. From it hung a pendant carved from turquoise and silver, shaped like a hawk in flight with the clan symbol etched into its breast. This was your great-grandmother's. It will help you remember who you are when the world tries to convince you otherwise. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer now, voices echoing off the canyon walls as their hunters coordinated their approach. But David no longer felt the paralyzing fear that had driven her for so many days. She felt instead a deep, calm certainty that whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, not as the broken child the school had tried to create, but as David Brighthawk, keeper of the sacred trust. There is one more thing, Running Bear said urgently, producing a small buckskin pouch. Seeds from the sacred plants of your people. Whatever happens, whatever you must do to survive, make sure these reach the place where they can grow. The spiritual power of your clan is tied to the land itself, and the land remembers its children. Shadow Wing's cry split the mountain air, sharp and warning. The eagle had been circling overhead, keeping watch, and now his voice carried urgent alarm. Through the narrow entrance to the valley, They could see the first of their pursuers appearing on the rim above. "Go," Running Bear commanded. "I will. Delay them as long as possible." "Come with us," David urged, but the old man shook his head. "My journey ends here," he said, with the calm acceptance of someone who had already made peace with mortality. "Yours is just beginning. Honor the ancestors by living, not by dying beside an old man who has already seen too many sunsets." They left the shrine at a run, Nantan leading the way through passages that Running Bear had shown them on previous visits years ago. Behind them, they could hear the confrontation beginning, Running Bear's voice raised in traditional Apache war songs. The angry shouts of men who had expected to find easy prey and instead encountered a legend who refused to die quietly. The escape route led through a series of natural tunnels that emerged on the far side of the mountain, miles from where their pursuers expected them to be. As they climbed toward the tunnel entrance, Shadowwing rejoined them, the eagle's presence somehow reassuring despite the desperate nature of their flight. "He knew," David said as they paused to catch their breath. "Running Bear knew this would happen. He was prepared to sacrifice himself to give us time to escape." "The old ways teach us that some things are more valuable than individual lives," Nantan replied. "Running Bear understood that your survival means the survival of something much larger than any one person." They emerged from the tunnels as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded David of the pictographs in the sacred shrine. The world spread out below them, vast, beautiful, and filled with both promise and peril in equal measure. But she was no longer the same person who had begun this journey. The sacred objects she carried, the knowledge that had been passed down to her, the formal acceptance of her role as clan keeper, all of it had transformed her understanding of who she was and what she was capable of becoming. "Where do we go now?" she asked, fingering the hawk pendant that rested against her chest. "Where Shadowwing leads us," Nantan replied, watching the eagle soar ahead of them toward the distant peaks. "The spirits have guided us this far. I think we can trust them to show us the rest of the way." As they began their descent toward whatever lay ahead, David felt the weight of responsibility settling more comfortably on her shoulders. She was no longer running from something, she was running toward it, toward a destiny that had been waiting for her since the day she was born. The medicine bundle pressed against her side with each step. The obsidian arrowheads clinked softly in their pouch, and the hawk pendant caught the last rays of sunlight like a beacon. She was David Bright Hawk, last daughter of the Hawk clan, keeper of sacred trusts and guardian of ancestral wisdom. And somewhere in the growing darkness behind them, Running Bear's war songs echoed off the canyon walls, carrying the defiant spirit of a people who had never learned how to surrender. Marshal Coleman found them 3 days later, but not in the way they expected. Instead of approaching with the measured pace of official law enforcement, he rode hard up the mountain trail with the urgency of a man carrying life-or-death information. His horse was lathered with sweat, and his usually composed demeanor showed cracks of barely controlled anger. "Thank God I found you," he called out as he dismounted near their small fire. "We need to talk, and we don't have much time." David instinctively moved closer to Nantan, her hand going to the medicine bundle that had become as natural a part of her as breathing. But something in Coleman's manner suggested he brought revelation rather than threat. "Marshal," Nantan said, carefully, "you seem troubled." "Trouble doesn't begin to cover it," Coleman replied grimly. He pulled a folded document from his vest pocket, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed emotion. "I've been doing some investigating since we last talked. Sending telegraphs, asking questions, following paper trails. What I found..." He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "What did you find?" David asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Coleman unfolded the document official letterhead, government seals, the kind of formal communication that carried the weight of federal authority. This is a secret order from the Department of the Interior, dated 3 months ago. It authorizes the removal of remaining obstacles to railroad development in designated territories of strategic importance. The words seemed innocent enough on the surface, but Nantan felt his blood chill as he grasped their true meaning. What kind of obstacles? Any individuals or groups with potential claims to lands needed for the Southern Pacific expansion. Coleman read directly from the document. The order specifically mentions elimination of documentation that might support native territorial disputes and neutralization of bloodline claimants who might challenge federal jurisdiction. David's hand moved unconsciously to the hawk pendant at her throat. They want to kill me because of who I am. It's worse than that, Coleman continued, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. The men who have been hunting you aren't bounty hunters working for the school. They're federal agents operating under direct orders from Washington. The story about you being a runaway ward was just cover for what amounts to a government assassination order. The implications hit them like physical blows. This wasn't about silencing a victim of abuse or recovering a missing child. This was about eliminating the last legal obstacle to one of the largest land grabs in American history. How did you discover this? Nantan asked. I have a friend who works in the territorial governor's office. He's been seeing documents that didn't make sense, survey orders for lands that were supposedly already owned by the railroad, legal opinions about the validity of Indian land claims, requests for information about surviving members of specific Apache clans. Coleman's jaw tightened. When I put the pieces together, I realized they've been planning this for months. David felt something shift inside her, a transformation from fear to a different emotion entirely. Anger, yes, but also a crystalline clarity about what she was truly fighting against. Not just personal survival, but the complete erasure of her people's connection to the land that had sustained them for countless generations. There's more, Coleman continued. The railroad companies have been working with certain officials to systematically destroy any evidence of traditional Apache land claims. They've been raiding sacred sites, stealing artifacts, and eliminating anyone who might serve as a witness to the historical truth. That's why they killed my parents, David said with sudden understanding. They weren't random victims of an accident or attack. They were murdered because they knew where the sacred sites were located, and because they had a daughter who could inherit their knowledge, Nantan added grimly. You're not just a surviving clan member, David. You're the key to proving that the railroad companies have been building their empire on stolen land. Coleman nodded solemnly. If your existence became known, if you could testify about traditional boundaries and sacred sites, it would call into question millions of dollars worth of development. The legal challenges alone could tie up the railroad expansion for decades. If summoned by their conversation, Shadow Wing appeared overhead, his powerful wings catching the mountain thermals as he circled their camp. But this time, he was not alone. 3 other eagles flew with him, their synchronized flight patterns suggesting some form of communication that transcended ordinary animal behavior. The spirits are gathering, David observed, watching the aerial display with eyes that had learned to see beyond the merely physical. They know something is about to happen. What do you mean? Coleman asked, following her gaze. In the old stories, eagles only fly together like that when the balance of the world is about to shift, Nantan explained. They're preparing for change, gathering power for whatever must come next. Coleman studied the eagles for a moment, then returned his attention to the immediate crisis. There's something else you need to know. The agents hunting you have been given expanded authority. They're no longer just trying to capture you quietly. They've been authorized to use whatever force is necessary to complete their mission. How many of them are there? David asked. At least a dozen, possibly more. They've been reinforced with men from the military, Soldiers who have been told they're hunting dangerous renegades who pose a threat to territorial security. Coleman's expression grew even grimmer. They're not planning to take prisoners. The weight of this revelation settled over them like a physical presence. They were no longer dealing with corrupt officials or overzealous bounty hunters. They were facing the full power of the federal government, deployed in service of corporate interests that saw an entire people's heritage as nothing more than an obstacle to profit. But even as the magnitude of their opposition became clear, David felt something unexpected rising within her. Not despair, but determination. The medicine bundle at her side seemed to pulse with warmth, and the obsidian arrowheads in their pouch clinked together like wind chimes in a breeze that touched nothing else. "They think they're hunting a frightened child," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "But that's not who I am anymore. Who are you?" Coleman asked, genuinely curious. David stood, the hawk pendant catching the firelight as she moved. "I am David Bright Hawk, last daughter of the Hawk clan, keeper of sacred trusts that reach back to the beginning of time. I carry the accumulated wisdom of generations of my people, and I bear witness to truths that certain men would kill to. Keep hidden." The transformation was complete. The terrified girl who had appeared at Nantan's fire had become someone else entirely, not through magic or mystical intervention, but through the simple act of accepting who she had always been, meant to be. "Then we need to get you somewhere safe," Coleman said. "Somewhere you can tell your story to people who have the power to act on it." "No," David replied with quiet conviction. "Running and hiding won't solve anything. They'll just keep coming. Keep hunting until they accomplish their goal. The only way to stop this is to force the truth into the open where it can't be ignored or covered up." Nantan looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop running away from them and start moving towards something worth fighting for," David said. "The sacred sites they're trying to destroy, the artifacts they're trying to steal, the legal claims they're trying to erase, all of it exists in one place that they can't touch without revealing their true intentions." "Where?" Coleman asked. David's eyes reflected the firelight as she spoke. "The territorial capital, where the governors and judges and federal representatives conduct their business in full view of the public. Where a little Apache girl telling the truth about murdered parents and stolen land might just cause enough of a scandal to stop this entire conspiracy." Shadowwing cried out overhead, a sound that seemed to carry approval of her decision. The other eagles answered in kind, their voices joining in a chorus that echoed off the mountain peaks. Like a battle cry, the hunt was about to become something else entirely. No longer a chase between predators and prey, but a confrontation between truth and corruption, between the rights of indigenous people and the appetite of corporate greed. And at the center of it all stood a young woman who had finally understood that sometimes the only way to survive is to stop running and start fighting back. The gathering took place in a hidden canyon that had served as a meeting ground for Apache leaders since time immemorial. Word had spread through networks that existed below the notice of white authorities. A whispered message passed from one trusted person to another, carried by traders and medicine men and the few remaining elders who remembered the old ways. They came despite the danger, despite the years of defeat and dispersion that had scattered them across the territory like seeds on barren ground. Chiricahua and Mescalero, White Mountain and Jicarilla representatives of bands that had once been separate nations, but now found common cause in the face of extinction. David stood at the center of the gathering, no longer the frightened child who had appeared at Nantan's fire weeks earlier. The sacred medicine bundle rested in her hands, its weight both physical and spiritual, as she faced the assembled leaders of her people. Some were old men who remembered the days of freedom. Others were young warriors who had never known anything but reservation life and broken promises. Mothers and sisters, she began in Apache, her voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. I stand before you as David Brighthawk, last daughter of the Hawk clan, keeper of sacred trusts that our enemies seek to destroy forever. An elderly woman named Desert Rose, whose face bore the scars of cavalry sabers from battles fought decades earlier, spoke first. Child, we have heard the stories of your escape, of the sacred sites revealed to you. But why should we risk everything for the sake of one person's heritage? Have we not lost enough already? It was a fair question, one that David had expected. She opened the medicine bundle, revealing the collection of sacred objects that Running Bear had helped her understand. The obsidian arrowheads caught the firelight, each one carved with symbols that represented different aspects of Apache spiritual life. Because this is not just my heritage, David replied, holding up one of the arrowheads. This was made by a master craftsman of the Hawk clan, but the techniques, the prayers that went into its creation, the spiritual power it carries, these belong to all Apache people. When they destroy my clan's sacred sites to build their railroad, they destroy part of all our spiritual heritage. A young warrior named Stone Wolf stepped forward, his expression skeptical. Pretty words, but what can we do against the combined power of the army and the railroad companies? We are scattered, outnumbered, and most of our weapons were taken. Long ago, David reached into the bundle again and withdrew the map that Running Bear had shown her. The hide covered with markings that detailed traditional territorial boundaries. We fight with truth instead of bullets, she said. We use the white man's own laws against him. She unrolled the map, spreading it on a flat rock where everyone could see. This shows the traditional boundaries of Apache lands as recognized in treaties signed with the United States government. Treaties that have never been officially invalidated, only ignored. Marshal Coleman, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, stepped forward. She's right, he said. I've been researching the legal foundation for railroad land claims in this territory. Most of them are based on the assumption that no valid native claims exist, but if traditional boundaries can be proven, the railroad would have to compensate the tribes for every acre they've taken. Desert Rose finished, understanding beginning to dawn in her weathered features. More than that, David continued, her confidence growing as she saw the assembled leaders beginning to grasp the possibilities. If we can prove that sacred sites have been deliberately destroyed to eliminate evidence of our claims, if we can show that the government has been systematically murdering people to prevent them from testifying, then we're not just talking about land disputes. We're talking about crimes that would shock the entire nation. Shadow Wing chose that moment to appear overhead, circling the gathering with the other eagles that had been accompanying him for days. Their synchronized flight patterns seemed almost ceremonial, as if they were blessing the proceedings from above. The spirits approve, observed an ancient medicine man called Whispering Thunder. But how do we get this evidence before people? Who have the power to act on it? The territorial officials are either corrupt or powerless, and the federal representatives take their orders from the same men who want you dead. David looked around the circle of faces, seeing decades of accumulated wisdom and bitter experience written in every line and scar. These people had survived the worst that the expanding American nation could throw at them, and they were still here, still fighting, still refusing to surrender their identity to the forces that would erase them entirely. We take it to the newspapers, she said. Not just the local papers that can be bought or intimidated, but the big Eastern newspapers that reach millions of readers. Reporters who are always looking for stories that will sell papers and expose corruption. Coleman nodded approvingly. There are journalists in cities like New York and Chicago who would love to get their hands on evidence of government assassination orders and corporate conspiracy. A kind of story that could destroy political careers and launch congressional investigations. But first, David continued, we need to gather more evidence. I know where some of the destroyed sacred sites are located. I know the names of the Men who killed my parents and others like them. And I carry artifacts that prove the historical continuity of Apache presence in these lands. Stone Wolf remained skeptical. Even if you can reach these newspaper men, even if they believe your story, what makes you think anything will change? The powerful protect their own. Because this isn't just about Apache land claims anymore, David replied, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had seen the full scope of the conspiracy arrayed against them. This is about whether the United States government can get away with murder in service of corporate profits. There are many white people who would be horrified to learn what's being done in their name. She thought of Martha Clearwater risking her life to help them escape, of Marshall Coleman choosing justice over career advancement, of the newspaper reporters she had never met but hoped would choose truth over convenience. Besides, she added with a slight smile, they're not expecting us to fight back. They think they're hunting a terrified child and a broken old Indian. They don't know they're facing the last keeper of sacred trusts that have survived since the beginning of time. The discussion continued as the sun set and stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky. Plans were made, responsibilities divided, contingencies discussed. Some of the assembled leaders would return to their people with word of what was planned, rallying support and preparing for whatever consequences might follow. Others would help gather additional evidence of the conspiracy, documenting destroyed sites and collecting testimony from survivors. But the core mission would fall to David, Nantan, and Marshall Coleman, a journey to the territorial capital and beyond, carrying evidence that could change the course of history if it could be delivered to the right people. As the gathering broke up and the various leaders disappeared into the darkness from which they had come, David found herself alone with Nantan by their small fire. Shadowwing had settled on a nearby perch, the other eagles scattered to whatever roost they preferred, but all of them remaining close enough to be summoned if needed. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Nantan asked, studying her face in the firelight. David touched the hawk pendant at her throat, feeling the smooth turquoise and the intricate carving that connected her to generations of women who had faced impossible odds with courage they found somewhere deep inside themselves. "I don't know if anyone can ever be ready for something like this," she admitted. "But I know who I am now, and I know what I'm fighting for. The spirits of my ancestors are with me, and I carry their accumulated wisdom and power. Whatever happens, I won't face it alone." From somewhere in the darkness came the sound of approaching horses, many of them, moving with the careful coordination of trained soldiers. Their pursuers had found the canyon, though how they had managed it so quickly remained a mystery. "Time to go," Nantan said quietly, already beginning to gather their belongings. But David didn't move immediately. Instead, she raised the eagle whistle to her lips and blew 3 clear, strong notes that echoed off the canyon walls like a challenge. Shadowwing responded immediately, launching himself into the night sky with a cry that was answered by a dozen other eagles from their hidden perches. "Let them come," she said as they prepared for the final phase of their journey. "I'm done running. It's time to show them what happens when you try to destroy something that was never meant to die." The confrontation came at dawn in the sacred valley where David's grandmother had once carved her name in stone. Federal agents had surrounded the area during the night, moving with the silent efficiency of soldiers who had done this kind of work before. But they had underestimated both the terrain and the determination of the people they were hunting. David stood at the center of the ancient stone circle, holding the eagle feather war staff that Nantan had crafted during their final night of preparation. The staff itself was a work of art carved from mountain oak and adorned with feathers from Shadow, Wing, and the other eagles who had joined their cause. But more than decoration, it was a symbol of leadership, a declaration that the last daughter of the Hawk clan was ready to make her stand. Surrounded, Marshall Coleman observed grimly, checking his rifle as government agents took positions on the canyon rim above them. At least 20 men, maybe more. Good, David replied, her voice carrying a calm that surprised even her. I want them all to see what happens next. Nantan moved to her side, his own weapons ready, but his focus primarily on the young woman who would become the center of their shared destiny. Are you certain about this plan? The ancestors are with us, David said, touching the hawk pendant at her throat. And Shadow Wing has brought allies. As if summoned by her words, the eagles appeared, not just Shadow Wing and the three who had been following them, but dozens of the great birds, emerging from hidden roosts throughout the canyon system. They filled the sky above the sacred circle, their synchronized flight patterns creating shadows that moved across the stone like living pictographs. Agent Morrison, the cold-eyed leader who had been hunting them for weeks, called down from his position on the canyon rim. You're surrounded and outnumbered. Send up the girl, and we'll let the rest of you live. David stepped forward, raising the war staff so that all could see it clearly. I am David Brighthawk, last daughter of the Hawk clan, keeper of sacred trusts that reach back to the beginning of time. If you want me, come and take me. Her voice echoed off the canyon walls, amplified by the natural acoustics of the place, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The eagles above responded with their own cries, a chorus of defiance that made several of the government horses shying nervously. This is your last warning, Morrison shouted. We have orders to bring you in by any means necessary. Then come, David called back. But know that you face more than just 3 people with rifles. You face the accumulated power of generations of Apache warriors, the spiritual strength of sacred places that your kind has tried to destroy, and the righteous anger of a people who have endured too much to surrender now. The first shots came from the rim, rifle fire that echoed through the canyon like thunder. But the agents quickly discovered that shooting down into the sacred circle was not as simple as they had expected. The ancient stones seemed to deflect bullets in impossible ways, sending them ricocheting harmlessly into the canyon walls. Shadow Wing led the aerial assault, diving at the riflemen with talons extended and wings spread wide. The other eagles followed his lead, attacking with a coordination that spoke of intelligence far beyond ordinary animal behavior. Horses reared and bolted, men dove for cover, and the carefully planned assault quickly devolved into chaos. Impossible, Coleman breathed, watching bullets curve away from their targets as if guided by invisible hands. The stones are protecting. U.S., not the stones, David corrected, her eyes reflecting a light that seemed to come from within. The spirits of everyone who ever stood in this circle, everyone who ever called on the sacred powers for protection. They're all here now, and they remember what it means to fight for something worth dying for. Agent Morrison rallied his men with the harsh efficiency of someone accustomed to violence, directing them to spread out and find better firing positions. But every attempt to approach the sacred circle was met by diving eagles and, mysteriously, misfiring weapons. The canyon itself seemed to have become an ally, offering concealment to David's small group while exposing their enemies to attack from above. This is what they fear, Nantan said, as he took careful aim at an agent who was trying to work his way down the canyon wall. Not our weapons or our numbers, but our connection to something larger than ourselves. They can kill individuals, but they cannot kill the spirit that connects us to this land. David raised the war staff again, and this time her voice carried the cadence of formal prayer, the kind of spiritual invocation that her ancestors had used when calling on the powers that governed the natural world. Spirits of the Hawk clan, spirits of all Apache people who have walked this sacred ground, I call on you to witness what happens here today. These men come not in the name of justice, but in service of greed and corruption. They seek to destroy what cannot be destroyed, to steal what can never truly be owned. The response was immediate and undeniable. The very air in the canyon seemed to thicken, becoming charged with the kind of energy that precedes a massive thunderstorm. The eagle's cries took on an almost musical quality, harmonizing with David's voice in ways that raised the hair on every arm and made the government agents look around nervously. From his position on the rim, Morrison fired a shot directly at David, the bullet following a perfect trajectory that should have found its mark. Instead, it struck something invisible in the air above the sacred circle and fell harmlessly to the ground, flattened as if it had hit solid stone. "Witchcraft!" one of the younger agents shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Worse than that," Morrison snarled. "It's Indian magic. The bullets are stronger than superstition." He signaled to his men, and they opened fire in a coordinated volley that should have ended the confrontation in seconds. But every shot went wide or fell short, as if the sacred circle existed in a space that ordinary weapons could not touch. Shadow Wing chose that moment to demonstrate the intelligence that had made him Nantan's companion. The eagle flew directly at Morrison, not attacking but simply hovering just out of reach. His fierce yellow eyes locked on the agent's face with unmistakable intent. For a long moment, predator and human stared at each other across a gulf that separated two completely different understandings of the world. Then Shadow Wing cried out once, a sound that seemed to carry all the defiance and dignity of a people who had never learned to surrender, and flew back to rejoin the aerial battle. "They're not just animals," Coleman observed with growing understanding. "They're fighting alongside us, as if they understand what's at stake." "All things are connected," David replied, echoing words that Running Bear had taught her. "The eagles know that if the sacred places are destroyed, if the traditional ways are lost forever, then the land itself will become sick and dying. They fight for their own survival as much as ours." The battle continued as the sun climbed higher, but it was becoming clear that the government agents faced more than they had bargained for. Their horses had scattered, many of their weapons had mysteriously malfunctioned, and the diving eagles made it impossible to maintain organized positions. But David knew that spiritual protection, however powerful, was not the same as victory. The real battle would be won not here in the canyon, but in the courtrooms and newspaper offices where public opinion was shaped and political careers were made or destroyed. "It's time," she said, raising the war staff one final time. "Time to show them what they're truly fighting against." She opened the sacred medicine bundle and withdrew the hide map that showed traditional Apache territorial boundaries, holding it high so that even the agents on the rim could see it clearly. The sacred circle began to glow. It started as a subtle shimmer around the edges of the ancient stones, barely visible in the morning light. But as David held the territorial map aloft and spoke the traditional words that activated the spiritual power of the place, the glow intensified until the entire circle pulsed with golden light that seemed to come from within the earth itself. "Behold the restored sacred circle of the Hawk clan," David called out, her voice carrying the authority of generations. "Let all who have eyes see the truth that corrupt men would hide." The transformation was not merely visual. Every person in the canyon, Apache and government agent alike, felt the shift as something ancient and powerful awakened from its long slumber. The very air hummed with energy that made the hair stand on end and the blood sing in their veins. "Agent." Morrison, despite his fear, raised his rifle one more time. "Orders are orders," he snarled. "Indian magic won't stop federal bullets." But when he pulled the trigger, the weapon simply clicked. Empty chamber. Impossible, since he had loaded it himself moments earlier. Around the canyon rim, his men experienced the same phenomenon. Weapons that had been functioning perfectly suddenly refused to fire, as if the sacred circle had somehow neutralized their capacity for violence. Shadow Wing landed on David's extended arm, his great wings spreading wide as he added his voice to her proclamation. The other eagles arranged themselves around the circle, each one perched on a carved stone, as if they had been waiting their entire lives for this moment. The sacred circle is restored, David announced, and as she spoke, the golden light intensified until it became visible even in the bright desert sun. The spiritual heart of the Hawk clan lives again, and through it, the connection between the Apache people and this land is renewed. She turned slowly, addressing not just the government agents, but the invisible audience she knew was watching. The spirits of her ancestors, the living members of her people scattered across the territory, and perhaps most importantly, the future generations who would judge the choices made in this sacred place. For too long, you have treated us as obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved, inconveniences to be eliminated. But we are none of those things. We are the original children of this land, its first protectors and its lasting guardians. Our connection to these sacred places reaches back to the beginning of time, and it will continue long after your railroads have rusted away and your minds have been exhausted. Marshal Coleman stepped forward, his badge catching the golden light, as he made his own declaration. As a sworn officer of the territorial law, I hereby place Agent Morrison and his men under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, destruction of sacred sites, and violation of federal treaties with the Apache people. You have no authority here, Morrison shot back, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. I have the authority of truth, Coleman replied calmly, and the evidence to back it up. He withdrew the government document that had revealed the assassination orders, holding it so that everyone could see the official seals and signatures. This order authorizes the murder of Apache people to serve railroad interests. When this becomes public knowledge, it will destroy the careers of everyone involved, up to and including members of Congress. The sacred circle began to glow dotted. Started as a subtle shimmer around the edges of the ancient stones, barely visible in the morning light. But as David held the territorial map aloft and spoke the traditional words that activated the spiritual power of the place, the glow intensified until the entire circle pulsed with golden light that seemed to come from within the earth itself. Behold, the restored sacred circle of the Hawk clan, David called out, her voice carrying the authority of generations. Let all who have eyes see the truth that corrupt men would hide. The transformation was not merely visual. Every person in the canyon, Apache and government agent alike, felt the shift as something ancient and powerful awakened from its long slumber. The very air hummed with energy that made the hair stand on end and the blood sing in their veins. Agent Morrison, despite his fear, raised his rifle one more time. Orders are orders, he snarled. Indian magic won't stop federal bullets. But when he pulled the trigger, the weapon simply clicked. Empty chamber. Impossible, since he had loaded it himself moments earlier. Around the canyon rim, his men experienced the same phenomenon. Weapons that had been functioning perfectly suddenly refused to fire, as if the sacred circle had somehow neutralized their capacity for violence. Shadow Wing landed on David's extended arm, his great wings spreading wide as he added his voice to her proclamation. The other eagles arranged themselves around the circle, each one perched on a carved stone, as if they had been waiting there. Entire lives for this moment. The sacred circle is restored, David announced, and as she spoke, the golden light intensified until it became visible even in the bright desert sun. The spiritual heart of the Hawk clan lives again, and through it, the connection between the Apache people and this land is renewed. She turned slowly, addressing not just the government agents, but the invisible audience she knew was watching. The spirits of her ancestors, the living members of her people scattered across the territory, and perhaps most importantly, the future generations who would judge the choices made in this sacred place. For too long, you have treated us as obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved, inconveniences to be eliminated. But we are none of those things. We are the original children of this land, its first protectors and its lasting guardians. Our connection to these sacred places reaches back to the beginning of time, and it will continue long after your railroads have rusted away and your mines have been exhausted. Marshal Coleman stepped forward, his badge catching the golden light, as he made his own declaration. As a sworn officer of the territorial law, I hereby place Agent Morrison and his men under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, destruction of sacred sites, and violation of federal treaties with the Apache people. You have no authority here, Morrison shot back, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. I have the authority of truth, Coleman replied calmly, and the evidence to back it up. He withdrew the government document that had revealed the assassination orders, holding it so that everyone could see the official seals and signatures. This order authorizes the murder of Apache people to serve railroad interests. When this becomes public knowledge, it will destroy the careers of everyone involved, up to and including members of Congress. The golden light from the sacred circle continued to pulse, and those who were sensitive to such things could feel the presence of something vast and ancient awakening. The eagles began to sing, not cries of aggression or alarm, but harmonious calls that seemed to celebrate the restoration of something that had been broken for too long. David raised the hide map again, and this time the markings seemed to glow, with their own inner light, visible to everyone in the canyon. This map shows the traditional boundaries of Apache territory as established by treaty with the United States government. Every railroad mile, every mining claim, every settler's homestead within these boundaries was established on land that was stolen in violation of federal law. The implications were staggering. If the map's authenticity could be proven, if the territorial claims it represented were legally validated, then the entire foundation of Western expansion in the region would be called into question. Morrison made one last desperate attempt to salvage his mission. Even if everything you say is true, you're still just one person. One person can disappear without a trace, and all your evidence disappears with you. But I'm not just one person anymore, David replied, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed to draw strength from the golden light surrounding them. I am the voice of every Apache who ever lived on this land, every ancestor who ever stood in this sacred circle, every future generation who will inherit what we choose to preserve or destroy today. As if summoned by her words, figures began to appear on the canyon rim, not government agents, but Apache people who had answered the call that had gone out through traditional networks. Desert Rose was there, her scarred face proud and defiant. Stone Wolf stood beside her, no longer skeptical, but ready to fight. Dozens of others, representing every major Apache band, had come to stand witness to what would happen next. And I am not alone, David continued, gesturing toward the assembled Apache. The scattered children of this land have gathered to reclaim what was always ours. You can kill me, Agent Morrison, but you cannot kill the truth I represent. You cannot silence the voices that will carry this story to every newspaper in the nation. The restored sacred circle pulsed with renewed intensity, and suddenly, everyone in the canyon could see what David had seen, the spirits of the ancestors standing among the living, their translucent forms arranged around the stone circle like guardians who had never truly left. The ancestors are here, David announced, her voice filled with wonder. They have come to witness the restoration of their sacred trust, and they will not be denied again. Agent Morrison looked around at the supernatural display, at the useless weapons in his men's hands, at the Apache witnesses who had appeared on the canyon rim, and finally at the young woman who stood at the center of it all, no longer a frightened child, but a spiritual leader whose power came from sources he could not understand or combat. This isn't over, he said finally, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man who knows he has already lost. No, David agreed. It's just beginning. The sacred circle of the Hawk clan is restored. The spiritual connection between the Apache people and their land is renewed, and the truth about what has been done in the name of progress will be revealed to the world. Shadowwing spread his wings and took flight, circling the sacred circle once before heading toward the canyon entrance. The other eagles followed, their synchronized departures seeming to signal that this phase of the struggle was complete. The golden light began to fade, but slowly, as if reluctant to return to dormancy. When it finally dimmed to a subtle glow that would remain as long as the sacred circle was respected and protected, David lowered the war staff and looked around at the transformed canyon. The hunt was over. The last daughter of the Hawk clan had found her true strength, and in doing so had awakened something that had been sleeping for far too long. The real work was just beginning. The work of ensuring that the truth revealed in this sacred place would change the world beyond the canyon walls. 1 year later, the New York Tribune's headline read, "Apache Sacred Sites Granted Federal Protection Following Congressional Investigation." The story that followed detailed the complete exposure of the railroad conspiracy, the congressional hearings that had resulted in criminal charges against government officials, and the landmark legislation that established the first Native American cultural preserve in United States history. But for David Brighthawk, now 14 and recognized as the official cultural guardian of the Hawk clan territories, the real victory was quieter and more personal. She stood in the same sacred circle where the confrontation had taken place, watching Shadowwing teach his offspring to hunt in the thermals that rose from the heated stones. The great eagle had indeed found a mate, as Nantan had predicted. Golden Wing, a magnificent female who had appeared shortly after the sacred circle was restored, had proven to be both a devoted partner and a fierce protector of their territory. Together, they had raised 2 eaglets who now soared overhead, their young voices adding to the eternal chorus that echoed through the canyon. "The circle of life continues," observed Nantan, who stood beside her with the contented air of a man who had lived to see justice triumph over corruption. His hair was whiter now, and his movements showed the careful pace of advancing age, but his eyes remained as sharp as ever. "And grows stronger," David added, watching the young eagles test their wings against the desert wind. The sacred sites are protected by federal law now, but more importantly, they're protected by a new generation that understands their significance. The cultural preserve that had been established around the sacred circle had become something unprecedented, a place where traditional Apache knowledge was taught alongside modern education, where the old ways were preserved not as museum curiosities, but as living practices that continued to evolve and adapt. David had become the bridge between worlds, equally comfortable in the university lecture halls where she studied law and journalism, and in the traditional ceremonies where she performed her duties as keeper of the sacred trust. At 14, she was fluent in 5 languages: Apache, Spanish, English, Navajo, and the legal language that had become essential for protecting indigenous rights in a changing world. "The newspaper stories helped," she said, thinking of the reporters who had flocked to the territory once word of the conspiracy began to spread. But it was the photographs that really changed people's minds. The image that had appeared on front pages across the nation showed David standing in the restored sacred circle, surrounded by golden light that the camera had somehow captured, with Shadowwing perched on her outstretched arm and the ancient stones glowing like beacons. It had become one of the most recognizable photographs of the era, a symbol of indigenous resilience that had inspired similar movements across the continent. Marshal Coleman, now appointed as the first federal Native Rights Enforcement Officer, emerged from the trail that led up from the new visitor center. His role had evolved far beyond traditional law enforcement. He now worked to ensure that the legal protections established for Apache sacred sites were actually enforced, and that similar protections were extended to other tribes facing similar threats. "The delegation from Washington is here," he announced. "They're ready for the ceremony." The ceremony he referred to was the official dedication of the new eagle nest that Shadowwing and Goldenwing had built in the heart of the sacred circle. The nest represented more than just successful reproduction. It symbolized the return of life to places that have been marked for destruction, the triumph of natural cycles over artificial disruption. The delegation included senators, congressional representatives, and officials from the newly created Bureau of Indigenous Cultural Protection. But more importantly, it included representatives from Apache bands across the Southwest, elders and young people who had come to witness the formal recognition of what they had always known, that some things were too sacred to be bought, sold, or destroyed in the name of progress. As the ceremony began, David took her place at the center of the sacred circle, wearing traditional dress that had been created specifically for this occasion. The dress itself was a work of art, decorated with beadwork that told the story of the Hawk clan's survival and the restoration of their sacred trust. The hawk pendant that had belonged to her great-grandmother rested against her heart, while the medicine bundle and its sacred contents were arranged on a specially prepared altar. 1 year ago, she began, speaking first in Apache and then translating into English for the mixed audience. This place was scheduled for destruction. The sacred stones were to be blasted apart to make room for railroad tracks, and the spiritual heritage of my people was to be erased as if it had never existed. She paused, allowing her gaze to move across the assembled crowd, taking in the faces of people who had traveled thousands of miles to witness this moment. But the spirits of my ancestors had other plans. They guided a wounded eagle to the camp of a wise Apache elder, and they brought a lost child home to the place where she belonged. Through their intervention, what was meant to be an ending became a beginning. Shadowwing, as if understanding the importance of the moment, chose that instant to launch himself from his nest and circle the sacred circle 3 times before landing on the perch that had been prepared for him near the altar. His offspring followed, their young voices joining his in a cry that seemed to bless the proceedings. Today, we dedicate this new eagle nest not just as a symbol of renewal, but as a promise, David continued. A promise that the sacred places of all indigenous peoples will be protected, that the wisdom of traditional cultures will be preserved and honored, and that the future will be built on respect for all life rather than the exploitation of the few by the many. The crowd responded with applause that echoed off the canyon walls, but David held up her hand for continued attention. She had one more thing to say, something that went beyond politics and law to the heart of what this day truly meant. When I first came to this sacred circle, I was a frightened child running from those who would do me harm. I had forgotten my true name, my heritage, my connection to the land that had sustained my people for countless generations. But the circle remembered what I had forgotten, and it helped me become who I was always meant to be. She looked up at Shadowwing, who had become not just a symbol, but a true partner in the work of preservation and protection. Now, as I prepare to leave this sacred place to continue my education and training, I do so with the knowledge that the circle will remain. New eagles will nest here, new children will learn the old stories, and new generations will carry forward the sacred trust that has survived everything those who would destroy it could throw against it. The ceremony concluded as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the sacred light that had once blazed from the restored circle. The delegation from Washington departed, with promises of continued protection and expanded programs for cultural preservation. The Apache representatives returned to their communities with stories that would be told around fires for generations to come. But for David, Nantan, and Shadowwing, the real ceremony was quieter and more personal. As the canyon settled into the peaceful silence of approaching evening, they remained by the sacred stones, 3 unlikely companions who had found family in each other and purpose in the preservation of something larger than themselves. What comes next? Nantan asked as they prepared to leave for the new house that had been built for them near the cultural center. Whatever the spirits guide us toward, David replied, touching the hawk pendant that would always remind her of the journey from lost child to cultural guardian. But for the first time in my life, I'm not running toward it or away from it. I'm simply walking forward, carrying the sacred trust with confidence that the path will be revealed when the time is right. Shadowwing spread his wings one final time, his silhouette stalk against the darkening sky, before settling onto his perch for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve the greater good, new ways to honor the ancestors who had made this moment possible. But tonight, in the sacred circle where it had all begun, there was only peace and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some things were indeed too precious to be destroyed by those who could not understand their true value.